Greetings and salutations. Good morning and welcome to the Agora. We are a forum to examine the unexamined life. We are a place where we talk about the things you might like to but are afraid to. We believe that the issues of faith, morality, ethics, and society are far too complicated, nuanced, and important to be solved through memes and celebrity rants on Instagram. And we believe that we live in a world where it's becoming easier and easier to disassociate and disconnect from many ideas you might not appreciate or might not find acceptable. And we believe that the world is better advanced when we consider the possibility that maybe our worldview could be wrong and needs some adjustment. So good morning, all. Coming to you live here from the beautiful city of Salem, Oregon. I am Garrett. This is my partner in crime, Ricardo. You might know him as Richard as well. And we are joined today by a very special guest, a man who has played a significant role in my development in the ministry and just in my own personal life. One of my former mentors from my time at Multnomah University, Dr. Michael Gurney, joining us all the way from the fine city of Portland.
Thank you for having me.
It's our pleasure. We hopefully the gift basket we sent you was encouraging enough, to entice you down here today.
What gift basket?
What? Oh, it's on the way. Trust me. Amazon Prime, they're backed up. So, Dr. Gurney, so just I'll let you share in a minute here. But again, just from a personal perspective, during my time when I was a student, my undergraduate and seminary days at Multnomah, I would say that more than any other professor there, Mike, you played a very critical role in my my development, my perspective on what it means to be a man of God, what it means to think critically about the faith and about the issues of society today, and who really inspired my love for considering things I haven't considered before. And I can honestly say I wouldn't be doing this here today. I wouldn't have the pleasure of dialoguing and engaging with students and people of all different faiths and backgrounds and ideas without your influence. So thank you for that. So why don't you share a little bit about yourself, about your journey, about your day job, and what brought you here today?
Well, I've been teaching at Multnomah University for over 20 years, and I think what got me interested in academics and particularly philosophy and also theology was prior to my undergraduate experience, I was in the Navy for 6 years. 4 of those years was on a ship, and when you're with people 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and I was trying to live out my faith in a very real and authentic way, and I found myself constantly engaging people's ideas and beliefs and trying to have honest conversations, and I was challenged. Why do I believe what I believe is true? And that really caused me to explore my faith and to say, why do I believe Christianity to be true, and what about these other views? And I found it incredibly invigorating. And I was also involved in discipling a bunch of other guys on my ship. We had a very active group of Christians, some of whom I'm still in contact with today, mainly through Facebook. And just being able to see how a robust faith, I think, really can grow, even in an adversarial context. And I've embraced this idea that if what I believe is not true, then I don't want to believe it. Why should I believe something that's false? So I want to seek after what's true and avoid what's false. And that's kind of my policy, I guess you can put it that way. And so that's been kind of my guiding strategy, and then trying to communicate that in the classroom as well.
Well, I think that's an interesting point you just made. I believe we're living in a society where, not everybody, but there are more and more increasing segments that would say, whether or not you believe something is objectively true or not doesn't really matter. If it's important to you, if it's true to you, if it makes you feel a certain way, it's as good as if it is objectively true. We once had a student basically say to us, who is not a Christ follower, say, what would make you abandon your faith, or what would make you change? And I'd said, if I discovered tomorrow that Jesus didn't truly rise from the dead, if there's irrefutable evidence, I would throw it away and say, well, it's been a good run, and that was great. And this student was kind of shocked. They're like, you just give up your faith that easy? I was like, well, yeah, if it's not true, if it's not objectively true, I'm not just going to believe something to make myself happier.
This person's, yeah, their idea of what is true was about more about how it made them feel and what sort of works rather than the idea of,
I think,
is it based in...
Not to get too far off on a tangent, but I think what we've seen is a shift. I mean, what's interesting to me from a religious perspective is, really Christianity kind of stands out unique in that it really does say, look, if what we believe is true, it's based on true historical events, namely the death and resurrection of Jesus. In the Apostle Paul, in his letter to the Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 15 says, if Jesus is not raised from the dead, your faith is in vain. That's really, at least from my exploration of other religions, that's really unique.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, I think what we've seen in our culture, and there's I think a lot of historical reasons why, and they do have to do with theology and philosophy. But I think we've seen a shift where now faith is no longer grounded in what is true, but what is grounded in how I feel.
Right. Yes. Well, is it part of that though? I mean, have you read Nancy Pearcey's book, Total Truth?
I haven't had a chance to read
Okay, well, she talks about
yeah.
Plato and the fact-value split and how the fact-value split has put it in. So, it used to be that religion was in the category of what's ultimately true. Now it's been put into the upper story, which is what values, right? Like what. So my religion is different than yours.
Well, that goes back to Kant. I mean, that's,
right.
Yeah,
And yet, at some level, I mean, it kind of gets to what we're going to talk about today, which is tolerance. At some level, for a modern society to work without being homogeneous,
yeah.
you kind of almost have to do that, right? Like in the sense that we have to understand that the way in which we argue about things is that the understanding is that other people have rights to practice the religion of their choice. Does that make sense? But the problem is that people confuse, it would seem that they would confuse the idea of things just being preferential choice versus actually what is true. And so there's this, it gets really muddy.
Well, and that's why I think when you go back to the kind of the history of the idea of tolerance, I don't know if we want to get into that right now, but
let's just jump on in.
It seems to me, at least in my reading, that the idea of tolerance, or maybe more accurately, the ideal of tolerance, that this is something that we should strive for, really doesn't begin to emerge until the Enlightenment. And really, and ironically, it comes back, it's rooted in the Reformation. Because with the Reformation, with Luther, I mean, that's why Luther is not just of theological interest, but of political interest, because the idea of freedom of conscience really begins to emerge here. And I mean, before the Reformation and before the Enlightenment, I think what you have, I mean, most cultures were pretty intolerant. I mean, to put it bluntly.
I don't think that's any hot take these days.
Yeah. They're and unfortunately, even Christianity has a black eye there as well. I think to a certain extent. Although interestingly enough, early on in the early days of Christianity, the first several centuries, you do have Christian thinkers who do try to make appeals. I was reading just the other day Athenagoras, making appeals to people in power, the rulers, to say, look it. We're not a threat to society, And when you go back to the Greco-Roman culture, as long as you paid homage to the gods, the local deities, you were good. But the Christians wouldn't do that, and that's what caused the problems. So, the argument was that, you should tolerate us because, one, we're reasonable people, and two, we promote morality, not immorality, and that's consistent with that.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask. So I have maybe a little different take on it, and you can respond. But it seems to me that tolerance is rooted in the basis of Scripture. So for example, I wouldn't say necessarily that's true of the Old Testament, right? God sort of says, be separate, don't intermarry, don't do this. But in the New Testament, the new covenant or our new relationship with God, right? I think of Galatians 3:28. Right, there's neither Jew nor Gentile, right? Neither slave nor free, nor is there male or female, for you are all one in Christ. And so there's just almost this move away from holding on to your identity, which would differentiate you from someone else.
Well, yeah, and maybe to unpack that a little bit more, but even in the Old Testament, I mean, if you read the Mosaic Law, there is, for those who are sojourners, to use an English term here.
Absolutely.
You're supposed to treat them well.
You're to treat them well, and you're called to love your neighbor. in part, and I know that a lot of people when they read the Old Testament, it seems unduly harsh.
Yeah.
But part of that is you have to understand, especially when you think about probably one of the big obstacles a lot of people have to the Bible in general and the Old Testament in particular is the conquest of the Canaanites.
Yes.
Right.
But I think we have to put that in proper historical context. That these tribes, if you will, because most of these are small ethnic, familial tribes, are very violent. It's warfare among warfare.
It's the only way to. It's constant. It's the reason why it took so long to make progress is because there's no stability.
Well, that's the only way to acquire anything was to take it from somebody in the classic sense. It was only very recently that we developed this cohesive economic, compatibility where when you benefit, I can benefit. That wasn't a concept back then.
What's interesting is even in the Old Testament, there is this idea. And particularly I think of the prophet Isaiah talks about how the purpose of God blessing the seed of Abraham, specifically the nation of Israel, was that they were to be a blessing to all the other nations. Mm-hmm. And the way they do that is they create this community, if you will, that is consistent with God's moral ideals, because that's the only way forward. That's the only way to have genuine community. Mm-hmm. And I think you see that then in the New Testament, you see that created where, as you pointed out, that no longer are the distinctions that were previously really, really important. Now it's neither Jew nor Gentile, slave nor free. And that's why even a lot of secular historians recognize that the growth of Christianity, the rapid growth of Christianity, is really unique, and it's largely caused by this ability by the early Christians to not base their relationships, their love for people on social standing. Because in the Greco-Roman culture, if you read any of that time period, social standing is incredibly important.
Right.
And in terms of not so much. There is some ethnicity. Even among the Greeks, they hated each. The various Greek policies hated each other, but it still was even more of economic, social class. So you had all these kind of social distinctions, and Christianity just basically ignores those things and says, look, all of us are in the image of God.
Yeah.
It goes back to Genesis and says, every human person is in the image of God. And of course, that's the foundation, I think, of Western civilization.
Right.
Well, and I think Christianity also, particularly in the New Testament, it established this idea that, like as you mentioned, all people, the idea of the Good Samaritan, somebody who is ethnically, culturally different, somebody that from a political standpoint you would shun, not want to associate with. The idea that Christ tells is that every single person, by virtue of being human, is entitled to certain dignity, to certain respect, to certain honor. Now, that doesn't mean that you agree with their entire worldview. It doesn't mean that when I'm helping this poor Samaritan who's been left for dead on the side of the road that I'm saying everything they do is right and I want to be just like them. But
in fact, it actually, I think the whole point of even what it says in Ephesians 4, it says, be completely humble and gentle, be patient, bearing with one, and that literally means to bear the weight, right? Yeah. Bearing with one another in love. Make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace, one God and Father. And there's this, I think the bedrock is there. I don't think the Christians over the years practiced this well.
I don't always practice it very well.
I think, and that's the problem when it gets spread out. Even Christians now attack each other nonstop over minute.
To go back to the example of Jesus. John chapter 4, when he's talking to the Samaritan woman. If you understand that. The cultural context of that, what Jesus is doing, he's breaking all sorts of taboos. Oh yeah. And I think in a lot of ways, the reason why this is such an important story in the Gospel of John is because for the early Christians, it's here's Jesus, our Lord, who is basically treating this woman as a person that is to be valued, but also notice that, and I think this is where, and then going back to Ephesians 4 as well, it's love conjoined with truth. And he's not afraid to say the Samaritans are wrong about the proper place of worship.
You're living in a state of sin.
And he's not unwilling to confront her on her immorality, but in a very loving and gracious way. Yeah. And I think that.
But he's also willing to be around her, which I think is a statement of.
Well, the very fact
and to listen to her and validate.
Well, the very fact that he asked her for water, that's just something a pious Jew would not do in Jesus' day.
So that's interesting. that's a paradigm that you can have both. You can have the viewpoint of I'm going to honor and dignify this person again, but also out of love, and this is another radical concept, that to love somebody means to speak truth harshly to them. Sometimes.
Well, I would say that's. Well, I mean, I think it would be directly or
but they come across to them as harsh.
Right.
Yes.
Right. I mean, or it may be challenging.
Yes.
And that's why I think when you look at the early Christianity and the early Christians, the importance of love and truth, I think are, like you said, the bedrock of their engagement with the broader culture. But as I said, I think that ideal carries over. And so when Christianity comes in power, once again, Christians didn't always do it right. But I think also, an obvious counterexample that people bring up about Christianity is, well, what about the Crusades? What about how they treated the heretics? I think there's some room for criticism, but you also have to recognize that they took seriously that theology matters. Yeah. And that what is really most important, what should be most important to us, is our eternal destiny. And so they wanted to stop the spread of bad theology to the point where people's eternal destinies were threatened. Yeah. And so they tried to, I don't necessarily say that they always did it right. I don't think you can justify everything they did, but I think we have to understand that in that context, in that time, it is incredibly challenging to I find this even true about myself personally. How do I live out truthfully and lovingly with my neighbor, particularly my neighbor who doesn't have the same values, the same beliefs that I do?
I think there's also a sense in which humans are humans.
Oh yeah,
are humans.
Yeah.
And so if you study the Salem witch trials, it's kind of weird because there wasn't that was happening all over the place. It was one place in the United States, and it looked like what happened was a girl said this other girl did some nuance, and that girl denied it, but they didn't matter. They were so afraid, and so fear, I think, led to all sorts of things. I think that's the other thing about, there's all sorts of other wisdoms about not jumping to conclusions, and but as we've moved forward as a culture, I think that we've moved towards tolerance, which is, I think, the only way to have a non-homogeneous.
Right. Well, and here maybe when we get to the Enlightenment, right? The Enlightenment, which we got to keep in mind here, the Enlightenment is primarily a European transported to the U.S. So our country was actually an Enlightenment experiment, political experiment.
Correct.
And I think one of the challenges, though, was that I think as we look at for example, John Locke, the philosopher, as he writes on the issue of human rights that are not grounded in government, they're grounded in God, and he's operating from certain Christian ideas that we're still dealing with, that they're still operating primarily in a very homogenous culture.
Yeah.
And so when the founding of the United States, and I think our founding fathers who are children of the Enlightenment, tolerance is seen as a great virtue. And I think for a couple of reasons. One is it's profoundly informed by this idea of the Enlightenment. It's on the one hand informed by Christianity, but it's also informed by certain Enlightenment ideals. And I think this idea of progress of knowledge, because the early Enlightenment thinkers are mostly Christians. Over time, though, the Christianity of these Enlightenment thinkers begins to morph. And, you need to get deism, and then of course you get the free thinkers who are some, especially in France, who become very become very atheistic.
Like Diderot.
Yeah, so you get this kind of diversity. But they still held on to, all of them still held on to this idea that humans have intrinsic value and worth and are to be treated respectfully. So you take this Christian ideal and then you take this optimism that we can, through knowledge and discovery of truth, we can make our political context, our nation states, our nations better. And we can discover more truth, especially with the natural sciences, the discoveries. You look back at the Galileo trial, which of course has been, I think, the Galileo controversy has been greatly distorted. And because sometimes
he misled them. He probably shouldn't have.
Well, so when you call the Pope, using your as your novel, you're creating this. The person who represents the Pope's position is Simplicus. That's not exactly a compliment, And there's some politics going on there, obviously. But the one thing a lot of people miss on the Galileo controversy was everybody involved was a Christian.
Yeah.
It's not like Galileo was a closeted atheist. He was a Christian, and everybody was, and a lot of the Christians. There were a lot of Christian thinkers that were in agreement with Galileo.
It's interesting because the whole Galileo thing. What I learned from the Galileo controversy is kind of this: that like the reason that if tolerance is a virtue, the reason it's a virtue is because it allows the best ideas to win.
Yes.
And so you don't get to the best idea by fiat or power, which is what they were trying to do, because obviously Galileo was right, and so was Copernicus. But the best idea will be persistent and gets its day in court, where it gets to be heard. And so if you value the best ideas, then the best ideas win, not just the power of a totalitarian regime, but the best idea.
And it requires process. I mean, with Galileo, of course, when Copernicus published he was on his deathbed, and he wasn't quite sure if he was right. A lot of people don't realize that Copernicus' hypothesis, the Copernican hypothesis, was primarily mathematical.
Right.
It was not empirical.
He didn't know inertia existed, neither did Galileo. They didn't have those understandings.
Well, but
if the world was turning, they said, why aren't we flung off of it?
Right. I mean, there were some serious objections, and even Galileo himself
Well, it's
admitted
flat anyway, so why don't we just walk off the edge?
But the point is that these require time and process. It requires debate. Because it wasn't just theological objections. In fact, really the main objection to the Copernican hypothesis was not theological, it was philosophical. It was Aristotle's conception of the universe.
Right.
Well, and it also speaks to this underlying human condition where nobody wants to be told, myself included, you don't want to be told that everything you've come to believe on a particular position could be wrong. It's not a natural human instinct to consider the possibility that we could be wrong, but if we actually, like you talked about, the best idea winning out and look at the advancement of society, we have to be willing to consider that proposition, that in light of new information, I'm willing to change my worldview. I'm willing to change the position.
Especially when they're deeply held beliefs.
Yeah.
If they're a deeply held belief, then it's hard to give those up.
Well, not just that you were wrong, but that your parents who taught you this were wrong, and that your society that says this is true was actually wrong. And it's not a lack of objective information, because we as humans are not purely mathematical, purely objective creatures, and that's good. As Chesterton once said, he said the madman isn't the one who's lost his reason. He's a man who's lost everything but his reason. We can't reduce the whole human experience to pure mathematical equations and pure reason. There is emotion. In
fact, Descartes tried that and failed.
Yeah.
Exactly. I think that's why, and even empirical. I think there's a recognition today that even the natural sciences, and I'm a big fan of the natural sciences, but even the natural sciences have their limitations in terms of explanation. Mm-hmm. And a lot of these things, especially the more we learn about our universe, the more we realize how little we know.
Yeah.
And that there are competing theories, and we wrestle with these things. And in order for there to be what we would call scientific progress, and that's even a debatable proposition among philosophers of science, but in order for there to be any hope of any kind of progress in terms of knowledge and towards truth, it requires the ability to have honest debate. And that requires tolerance.
And I think one of the greatest misnomers, I'm with you, I think that we have to recognize the value of scientific advancement. Even, I think Christians, there's this notion that, the more we discover, we might realize that we can explain the universe without God. I would say it's actually the opposite. The more you discover, the more you recognize the need for a creator. That's another topic for another day.
Yeah.
But oh gosh, where was I going with this? It was something good. That's right. Oh, okay, no, I was just going to say that I think one of the great misnomers is that there are some people who will try to present the idea that science is bias-free. There is no predisposition. There is purely you just let the evidence speak for itself, and that's it. And as opposed to a faith-based worldview that is wholly based in bias, and that is absolutely untrue.
I think certainly we want to strive for objectivity.
Of course.
And of course, objectivity itself is a very complex notion that we won't get into. But I think that this idea that scientists come in, they put their white lab coat on, they're purely objective. It's just plainly,
their biases at the
plainly
door.
false. I mean,
You know, I think the whole thing is, first of all, the idea that the best idea wins is an enlightenment idea.
Right.
That just totally comes out of that. And I believe part of what the founders of the United States were trying to do was to put it in such a way so that people could follow ideas, that they were free from, like, the pursuit of happiness is you can do what makes you happy apart from the condoning of the government to certain limitations.
Yeah.
But Erasmus, who is a Dutch Renaissance humanist and Catholic, he was writing on religious tolerance, and in De Libero Arbitrio, I probably pronounced that wrong, he was opposing Martin Luther, and he noted that religious disputants should be temperate in their language. Sure. And so what this means is, extremism comes from when you kind of look at the other side as being completely and wholly evil, like we don't treat them as human, we treat them as another, right? And so the more your language goes to a point where someone is so horribly, horrendously evil, you then give you almost license to treat them bad, and to do evil things. And one of the things that he talks about is that the interlocket of ideas, it temperates people. And he uses Cicero to talk about this, and he says truth is actually furthered when ideas can come together and can temper each other, because it generally moderates people rather than allows them to go into extremism. Like, for example, on Facebook today, I mean, we've probably said this a bazillion times, but if you are unfriending people you disagree with, whether or not they always post something true or not, because that's always the thing, right? Oh, they're posting, but if you do that, you're locking yourself in your own bubble, and you will never hear something that might be a valid position of that somebody else is bringing out. And so it is better to engage with ideas, which is really scary for people, than to not engage with them, because otherwise you're locking yourself into a little bubble. You're never hearing another perspective. So the best ideas aren't getting heard.
Yeah, you bring up a really good example in terms of the Luther-Erasmus debate. I remember reading that debate, and even though I find myself on Luther's side, I found myself much more sympathetic to Erasmus. I mean, Luther, for all his, I have a great respect for Luther, but his rhetoric was not always very nice. To put it rather nicely.
And he would say it's born out of good intentions, because the truth of Scripture, the truth of the gospel above all else.
And I think that Luther probably, I think Luther's personality, if he didn't have that personality, probably Reformation would never have happened. He has almost kind of
right place at the right time.
But that's not to excuse his rhetoric. And
he also was willing to go up against the most powerful force
in
Europe at the time. And that's not like an easy thing. You don't just
no. I mean, it's pretty intimidating. When you have but anyway, but I think that, and of course, what's interesting to me is when you look at the rhetoric back then, Erasmus is kind of the outlier, isn't he? I mean, because most people's rhetoric is pretty extreme. And I think we have a modern day, what we're seeing on Facebook is kind of similar to that, where people tend to not be willing to listen. But I think that you make a really good point. And let me just give it a contemporary example here. I hear a lot of Christians who who I largely agree with in terms of their critique of some of the neo-Marxism that's happening. But there's a presumption there that everything Marx said was wrong. Mm-hmm. Well, even a broken clock is right twice a day.
Yeah.
And I would say even Marx, even though I think his philosophy, his theory of economics, his overall presumptions about human nature are fundamentally flawed. That doesn't mean that everything Marx said was wrong. When you put him in his historical setting, where you have the Industrial Revolution happening, the working man is being abused.
Yeah.
I think he raises some legitimate, even though I do tend to lean, I do consider myself a capitalist, I do think there is such thing as crony capitalism, that we need to hear the criticisms, even from people who are Marxists or neo-Marxists, and say, you know what, you got a point here. So I think that the importance of listening to people, even when you disagree with them, can be of benefit.
Well, and that brings up an interesting perspective, and Facebook only highlights this because you can literally, like you talk about, pick and choose the news you want to hear. You can pick and choose the groups you want to associate with. So we're living in a society more and more where you don't look at the value of an idea, you look at somebody's association or a group and say, I immediately dismiss all their ideas because they're part of this group, rather than looking at the ideas individually. And you're right, this happens on all extremes.
Yeah, there's all sorts of virtue signaling going on from people who, across this political spectrum.
Exactly, and recognizing, like you talk about Marx, every idea is born out. It doesn't just, it isn't formed in a vacuum, this ethereal vacuum of our mind. It's born out of our life experience. And recognizing that there's something that happened in that person's life, like the life of Marx, like the life of the person you might completely disagree with, that led them to believe this is good, this is true. And versus, as opposed to just dismissing and saying you're crazy, saying, okay, what is it that led you to this conclusion?
Marx's life is interesting because if you look into it, he had a very rich benefactor who kept bailing him out over and over and over. And then you're like, but you want to kill the bourgeoisie who literally bankrolled your entire career? Very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, neither he or Engels. Engels is the son of a rich corporate owner. And,
Isn't this the idea though? Like, interesting that some ideas work really well theoretically, but practically, like, just don't work. And so there's that's why I'm talking about the temperance of a theory versus just the theoretical position of it.
But I would say we need to step back before that and say, I think we need to be, good listeners first.
Right.
And I think too many people today, and I think part of it's just the culture we live in, and we have everything's instantaneous. The microwave, we have instantaneous food. And I think we tend to do the same thing with ideas.
Process.
And we don't.
We are spoon-fed the conclusions.
Exactly. I want to know what to believe. Tell me what to believe. I don't have to do the hard work of thinking it through, hearing different perspectives and different reasons and ideas.
Well, what was the stat you shared, Richard? Like 70% of millennials only read the headlines of an article.
It's a huge.
Well, and
so
part of
basically, they'll read the headline and they come to the conclusion.
And the headline tells you what you need to hear.
And there are so many examples of headlines misleading what the actual article is saying.
Well, because a lot of times the writer doesn't write the headline; it's the editor that writes the headline.
Yeah.
So.
In my 20 plus years of teaching, one of the things I've noticed is that, and I think this isn't just true about the younger generations. I think it's true about all of us because there's so much information and ideas that are being thrown at us that in order to try to process them, we've developed certain strategies. And I think to do that, what we've done is we just kind of we don't learn how to think about things. We just I want to know what to believe and I'll believe it. Right. And this applies across the spectrum to matters of it's not just religion, it's science, it's
the sociology too of how social media works is that it actually creates a reward center in your brain as well. It's like, so when you scroll, you're actually rewarding yourself. So the idea that you stop and process information isn't really like part of that's not the purpose of it. Yeah. I wanted to say something that I think was really important. I remember being in college, and I think one of the most influential courses I took was a history of ideas courses, and it outlined how ideas, so we tend to think we live in a modern moment, but the reality is that there are currents that underlie society, and those ideas flow through. And anyway, I just remember my professor doing such an amazing job at linking up how certain philosophers' ideas began to take hold, like Locke's ideas about social contract theory, and most people were like, what's that? And the idea that humans are born as blank slates and all these things, and how these ideas took hold. Thomas Reid's ideas about how humans function.
He's my philosophical hero.
Right. You know what's funny is that basically the philosophy department that I went through, they ignored him completely. And I was like, he is the single most influential philosopher of American history, period.
I actually did my dissertation on Reid's influence
in
the area of theology primarily.
Nobody talks about him, and it was really frustrating. But I also remember one of the things is reading Nietzsche, and really being like, I don't agree with this guy, but he's really smart, and he gets some things.
Well, and he's blatantly honest. Despite, right. He's not willing to say the world is a dark, wretched, ugly place. There's no hope.
read him because I remember reading his perspectivalism.
Conclusion.
He has, but it was just, it was very interesting to be like, if you remove the idea that there is a fundamental truth to what it means to be human, that is what you're left with. You're just left with all these perspectives, and nobody's really right.
Well, actually,
all that's left is
actually with Nietzsche, it's all about
power.
will.
Yeah.
It's will.
Yeah.
Power.
And he gets that from Schopenhauer, and but he,
right.
I think
Devoid of truth, you decide what's true, and then you use your will, and after that,
right.
if you gain power, that's what makes you true.
I think he's being consistent with his position.
Exactly.
And this takes us, I think, with the Enlightenment. What happens is, because I think the whole point, I think the motivation for the Enlightenment thinkers was if we can come up with a universal understanding of what is knowledge and truth, then especially the religious wars that were going on, the 30 Years' War, that we can resolve these conflicts. And of course, what postmodernism represents is not always a rejection, but saying, look, the Enlightenment project failed.
It did.
Well, at least that's their contention.
I would say I don't think it did.
And I think
science has been amazingly successful.
Well, yeah, but it does. But philosophy, you get guys like Paul Feyerabend who point out that, and this goes back to Thomas Kuhn's observation that there is a social dimension, the creation of paradigms that suggests that maybe science isn't just a matter of observing nature. There's a sociological dimension here.
Well, and you can't observe it from a completely blank box. Again, you can't step outside your perspective and your life experience and observe anything.
Sciences has been so expanded to the point that, like, we talk about social theories as science, and I would be objectionable whether I would allow that.
Well, I don't want to get out too far because the word science itself actually originally was used as just general knowledge.
Right. But so the word psychology was the Enlightenment's way of saying we can study the human psyche and we can put science to it.
You can boil everything down.
In the same way we can physics and like sociology.
Right. But even before that, Plato talks a lot about the soul.
Theology is these are all products of the Enlightenment. So I would be a little hesitant of pushing back and saying, hey, we need to.
But I want to get to I don't want to get back to the point though. Is I think what happens with after the Enlightenment, and the general perception that the Enlightenment failed to come up with a clear, universal definition of knowledge and truth. That what this has created, I think, is the rejection of truth, and its connection with, or a truth in any objective sense, and its connection with tolerance. So I think that's where I would see a shift. Whereas tolerance, I think that the ideal of tolerance in the Enlightenment period is primarily that idea that people have value and worth, and they're to be treated respectfully, and that in the intercourse of ideas we can further advance knowledge to truth. But if you take truth out, if you take truth out, that's kind of is the goalpost. Truth is what we're striving for, and this goes all the way back to the pre-Socratics. But if truth is taken out, then what's left? And so I think what we've seen is a shift in the idea of tolerance away from this idea that tolerance is primarily about persons. We tolerate persons, not wrong ideas or false ideas. Now, certainly we want to hear the ideas and determine whether they're true or false. But and that requires process, as we've talked about. But that, so that people have to have freedom to do that. This is where political liberty becomes very important. But once you take truth out of that equation, what are we left with? So then that's why I think we've seen this idea of tolerance has shifted from we tolerate persons to the idea of ideas, that we have to accept all the ideas. And of course, the problem is you can't do that. You can't live that out.
Are you saying that some ideas are logically incompatible, that 2 + 2 can't equal both 4 and not 4 at the same time?
Exactly. Yeah.
So yeah, I think there's this tension that I think, like, what I would call is encapsulated in classical liberalism, which is the historical understanding of the idea of what it doesn't have the same meaning that people think of it now.
Right.
People think of liberal now as meaning of political, but classical liberalism was just an idea that you as an individual had freedom, economic freedom to do what you
It's
want.
much closer to modern libertarianism.
To think about what you want. Well, it's
the highest political good is individual liberty.
Yeah.
Correct, and that is a fundamental change, of course, throughout the human history.
Yeah.
Right.
The individual is also the smallest minority.
The individual is what?
The smallest minority.
The smallest
and that's
minority.
why, to me, to kind of, when you look
You
at
get into critical theory and
the
all
founding
that.
fathers and the creation of the American Republic, what they are trying to do in the development of the political system is you want to avoid two tyrannies, the tyranny of the majority and the tyranny of the minority.
Yeah.
And they're trying to find that balance. And I think that, so when we talk about classical political liberalism, it's that attempt to really create a state or a nation that acknowledges and respects the minority, gives them freedom to have their ideas, even if they're not popular.
Yeah.
But also with the idea that that we can, there's this kind of optimism, there's this underlying optimism that as we engage these different ideas, that's going to, in the long run, can make everybody better.
Well,
a more flourishing city-state, or nation-state, I should say.
And I think too, so you mentioned the idea of classic liberalism, this idea that individual liberty, personal autonomy should be valued above all. Obviously, we recognize that doesn't mean that just because I want to do something I have the right to. If I want to cause physical harm to somebody, at that point, my rights in and I'm impinging on their rights, their freedoms to not be harmed. And I think what we're seeing today is a major shifting of the goalposts in that idea of what causes harm to others. Now we see the many elements saying, well, words cause harm, so we have to suppress people even saying words, let alone actions. Yeah. We can't allow certain people to even have a platform. We cannot tolerate it because by them even having their voices heard, their ideas heard. I've seen sociologists who've written papers advocating that words should be equated with the same as physical assault because there is no disconnection between the mind and the body. You hear a trigger word, it causes a physical reaction. You are causing physical harm by saying certain words.
I'll take people yelling, screaming at me, cussing at me any day than blowing my brains out.
Yeah, or destroying my business and livelihood. But I just think that so the sense of what causes harm to others, there's some people wanting to take that idea and shift it so far over that it's eliminating so many new ideas and dialogue from happening.
I think I think part of the reason why we've seen this shift is a couple of factors. One is when you go back to the founding of this country, it's fairly homogenous.
Yeah.
In terms of the people who participate in the democratic process.
Well, it's fairly disconnected too.
Well, and of course,
unlimited. I mean, there were swaths of people who weren't part of that process.
Exactly.
Yes.
Particularly we think of the slaves.
And we need to recognize that.
Yeah.
If you weren't a property owner, if you weren't male, you were kind of pretty much excluded. So that allowed to.
Right.
But as we've expanded that notion of citizenship,
yes.
and as we become more pluralistic, not only do we have people from Europe, we have people from Africa who participate in the process. We have people from Asia who are participating in the process. And of course, there's not just Christianity. Now we have Eastern religions. So you have all of these mixing. It becomes much more difficult to have a set of commonly shared values and beliefs.
Well, that's just on a side note on that, because I got to say, I love when people say, well, we should take the system that works in Denmark or Iceland, or a country with a few million people. It's incredibly homogenous and apply it to America. And I'm like, you don't realize that because we are such a melting pot, things are harder because you have so many different value systems coming to the table.
And I think in addition to that, I think because, rightly, so I think our country was founded on the notion of human rights and freedom.
Absolutely.
But I think, as some have pointed out in the last 10, 15 years, our obsession with rights, and this is not just true about one side of the political spectrum as opposed to the other. I think it's just a different set of rights.
Exactly.
So people who tend to be conservative or on the right, gun rights, for example, is very treasured. And on the left, bodily autonomy, like on the abortion issue.
Yeah.
So we've become obsessed with rights, and so now it's a battle of rights. Mm-hmm. And I think what gets lost in all of that, and of course the lack of homogeneity, is that what gets lost in all of that is that we've lost the idea of civic virtue. And this is something when I started.
You mean if I disagree with you, I start throwing things at you, yelling at you, like?
Well,
is that what you mean by civic? Like,
I go back.
I just watched a video yesterday. Apparently, these people's flight got delayed.
Oh yeah.
And they did you guys see this video? Anyway, and
I
they
can
went in and then attacked the people who were just sitting there, and they're like, it's not our fault the plane got delayed. They attacked them, and they're like trying to defend themselves and then get off, and it's nuts.
See, it's interesting to me when you go back to.
Is that what you mean?
Well, what I mean by civic virtues, I mean Plato talks about this, Aristotle talks about this, Cicero talks about this. It's amazing how much the early Christian thinkers and the pagans, Plato and Aristotle, those guys, agreed upon virtue. What is virtue, and what are the virtues? And of course, the belief, and you go back, if you read Plato or Aristotle on this, they talk about how in the city-state, the polis, that it's important for the citizens to be a people of virtue. And that's foundational to any hopes that the community can flourish. That's the key to flourishing. And I think another factor in what we're seeing today, the dysfunctionality of today, is because we lack moral virtue. And we lack it because our culture has largely embraced moral relativism. And to me, it's the great...
It feels good to you, do it.
Yeah, and the great irony to me is this. On the one hand, people want to say, what may be wrong for you may not be wrong for me, right? You hear that all the time. Who are you to impose your morality on me?
I don't know if I hear that as much anymore.
Well, that's the funny thing is because, and I would point this out to my students when I talk about moral relativism. If moral relativism is true, then there is no such thing as justice with a capital J.
Right.
Because justice turns out, according to moral relativism, is you have your justice, I have my justice. My community may have their conception of justice. Your community may have their conception of justice, and nobody's right.
Well, and then what
and
you
nobody's
have
wrong.
is what Nietzsche said, which is you have factions of people.
Then it becomes a matter of will.
Different ideas. Well, yeah. But then it ends up just being who has the most power. But is that really just?
And
so the concept of justice, has to be in place.
Right. That even those who don't have power have representation and have a voice and have certain dignity they're entitled to, even the completely powerless.
It kind of goes like this, if I may. I remember one of my professors who was an atheist and a very nice guy, but he said, it's interesting, the way the Constitution is written is that we are given inalienable rights, and yes, we all know they weren't given to everybody up front. We get that, and they should have been, and we've expanded that and have corrected it since.
Or at least trying to.
Trying to, yes. Yeah. But the idea was he put it, pretty out there. He says, even for me as like an atheist, I recognize, how do you ground the value of humans outside of the concept of saying like God is the one that says all humans are equal? And he was like, I don't have an answer for that. And I thought that was very honest of him, at least to, I'm sure there are lots of people who would jump up and be like, oh, we've got an answer. But it was one of those really
good one.
Social contract's the closest that I've seen, but it still falls
I have
short.
been in several public debates on university campuses where I've debated atheists on this topic. Now, and it's important to point out here, I'm not saying that atheists are immoral.
Right.
Yes.
In fact, most atheists I met have tried to be really good people. They try to be moral people. But for me, that's even a bigger problem for the worldview.
Yeah, they have
because
a problem.
Where does morality come from?
Whereas at least someone like Nietzsche or dissect, on the extreme, was at least honest, where he says, hey, there is no good, there is no evil, there's no God, there's no nothing. So if it makes you happy to, dismember babies for sexual gratification, then do it.
But since in our culture we've largely become secularized, and we've tried to remove any kind of religious, theological considerations from the public square, then all of a sudden, and I think we're seeing the practical results of this, then it becomes really, really difficult to have dialogue, genuine dialogue, where people are talking and disagreeing with each other. In fact, let me just give you, here's my definition of tolerance. And I would ground it in the classical sense. I define tolerance as to disagree agreeably. I mean, it's really simple. To disagree agreeably.
I can even fit on a bumper sticker.
Yeah. And I think on the one hand, we acknowledge, either 2 + 2 equals 4 or it doesn't equal 4.
And so the idea of disagreeing, the other extreme to that would be if I disagree with you, I can do anything I want to hurt you.
Well,
Go after
and that's where the
you.
agreeability comes into play, where we see that we recognize that even if somebody is wrong about an idea or a belief or a value, that doesn't give me the right to mistreat them.
Right.
Because
Otherwise, you're committing the same sin that basically every other group that has been in power does, or who has not been in power, even those who.
And the reason, but to me, the only way to make sense of that, and this goes back to the atheist issue of in morality, is because when I look at a person, I see them has somebody who is in the image of God and therefore has value and worth, no matter what they've done. And that's why, just to give an extreme example of this, that's why the idea of punishment, criminal punishment, in the most extreme cases, where somebody murders somebody, we make a distinction between legitimate criminal punishment, suppose, for example, the death penalty, and I realize that's a controversial topic, but just for the sake of argument, say, that capital punishment is correct. But we make a distinction between legitimate forms of capital punishment as opposed to just taking somebody out and beating them to death.
The lynch mob mentality.
Just kind of a lynch mob mentality. Because you recognize that even though that person has done something that's it's egregious what they've done, even somebody like Saddam Hussein or Adolf Hitler, that they still retain that image of God. And
I wonder if there's many people who really, even like 20 years ago, Saddam Hussein, I wonder if people even really know what he did. You know what I mean? Like I don't even know if we have in our modern culture, we live so much in this. Yeah. You know what I mean? Everything is right now, what's going on, that there is not a temperance of looking at the whole picture. Because I actually wonder if there's a lot of young people who are like, Saddam, wait, I got to Google that.
Well, did you guys hear the story about...
What did he do? From 10, 15
it's the loss of history.
It's mid-90s, so what is that? Gosh,
well, he was executed in 2005, I think. He was captured in 2003, I think executed in 2004 or 2005.
War crimes.
Well, I think what we're getting at, though, is that there's got to be some sort of standardized system of justice, not just everyone's opinion about what justice is for that individual.
Goalpost, it's kind of unfair because then there is no sense of consistent justice. And there are books out right now, I think, redefining terms of racism, terms of that have long held been classically stable, redefining those things and then saying the goalpost has moved.
Because once again, we've gotten away from the idea of truth.
Yes.
Right. Where truth, where now truth becomes, primarily pragmatic, or truth becomes localized in the sense of our community. We have our truth. Yeah. We apply this in the area of religion. People say, well, Christian. I see the bumper sticker coexist, for example.
Yeah.
And people say, I applaud. Huh? I applaud.
Yeah.
I applaud it because
coexist doesn't mean co-agree on everything.
No, well, I totally understand, but I do think there's. Listen, you got to be honest with. There's a whole long history of Christians, Catholics, Muslims, everybody killing everybody.
Sure,
and this is where I get to where I remember I in some way accept the fact values split on a pragmatic reason, and that is I don't know a way to get homogeneous. We are not a homogeneous society, and we probably never will be. We're a melting pot, right? And if we really want the future where the one Christian can sit next to someone else who's an atheist and doesn't believe anything they believe, and yet they can be friends and they can be neighbors and they can get along. You have to elevate, I don't know if I'd call it a higher value, but you'd have to elevate this idea of what the Constitution says, which is you have a right to life, liberty, and your pursuit of happiness. And your pursuit of happiness can be totally 100% different than mine. And that person doesn't even have to accept truth to live that out.
Let me disagree agreeably with you.
Okay. Man.
Because I think you and I would agree that it's wrong to mistreat people of other religions, right?
I don't think being a follower of Jesus gives you that.
Right. Yeah. In other words, I think I would agree with you if what they mean by in the bumper sticker, and I don't, when I don't ask people to pull over and
I
set
get
my
what
bumper
you're getting
sticker.
at, which is it's misdirected, but I would, yeah.
Right, but I would say is that the reason why, yes, religions we ought to respect other religions and not mistreat them, it has to be grounded in this prior idea that they are in the image of God, regardless of their beliefs. So, but the problem has become what I think a lot of people intend, particularly people who embrace what we call religious pluralism, is that coexist doesn't mean just accepting them. Because frankly, here in America, I mean, yeah, there are some outliers. There are some people who engage in religious bigotry.
Right.
But
or
for the
people
most
who
part,
just are ignorant, like the Sikhs always get labeled as Muslims. They're not. They're Sikhs.
They're the most peaceable, non-violent people on the planet.
I've been to the temples and
best lentil soup you'll ever have. Just hop on there.
But what people do is they say to coexist means not just to accept them as being here and being able to practice their religion, also means accepting their views as equally valid.
That they're propositionally true in the same manner that your beliefs are propositionally true. And that's where I say
then the problem becomes, and here's the problem. And this is where this leads to another problem, which is, and we're seeing this firsthand in a global level, when you see Christians being killed by Muslims. You're seeing Christians kill Muslims. You've seen Buddhists. Buddhists always portrayed as
there was a huge violent uprising where they killed a whole bunch of Muslims because they don't want them in their country.
Yeah, and I think because once again, I think especially in the media, they've tried to portray, and certainly I've known a number of Muslims, and they're good people, they're very neighbors. But on the other hand, there are people who read, and I've read the Quran, not in Arabic, but in English.
So you haven't really read it.
Yeah, technically I haven't read it, but and certainly I can understand why some Muslims, in fact, perhaps the majority of Muslims in the world, do believe that that religious tolerance should not be applied in Muslim states. Now, they're not necessarily advocating killing. It's not a value of them, and they're being consistent, I think, with what their religious beliefs are.
Islam never had its Acts 15 moment, and that's one of the big distinctions. And so at the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15, where the issue of Gentile inclusion in the faith-based community, because a lot of Christians don't realize this. The early Jews, had a lot of them were fine saying yes, Jesus is the Messiah. The issue for them was, can non-ethnic Jews be included in the faith community? And basically, the conclusion they came to is that I think it's an interesting dichotomy, because they say basically don't put unnecessary stumbling blocks. We couldn't keep the laws perfectly of circumcision, but at the same time, they do give some standards that say abstain from sexual immorality. So in other words, there are certain non-negotiables. For covenant inclusion.
But I think
so I think what you're getting at, if I may elucidate what you're trying to say, and you tell me if I'm
okay.
I'm just seeing how many times I can use elucidate today with those that come across.
Man. That sounds like
Could you elucidate my food a little bit more?
So what you're getting at is there's an essential element missing in that. So, in the coexist bumper sticker, what they're saying is live together, and we want to treat all your views as equal. And what you're saying is that the problem with that is that the claims of each one aren't the same. Right. And so we have to, and so we wouldn't, we
wouldn't do it with mathematics. Can you imagine a child in school? In fact, let me give you an example. There was a story done, a column that was given in the New York Times. I read this to my students, and the professor was a philosophy professor whose son was in school, and his child brought home some homework, and they were talking about the difference between facts and opinions, and this really intrigued him, especially as a philosopher. And he noticed that in the worksheet, anything that had to do with morality was categorized as an opinion. Not a fact, but as an opinion. Right. Okay. So he goes to his next parent-teacher conference, and he talks to this teacher, poor teacher, and he says, I noticed that in my son's homework that anything that was having to do with morality was categorized as an opinion. And she said, well, of course. He says, really? So you think morality is just merely a matter of opinion? She goes, well, isn't it? And he goes, so then you wouldn't have a problem with your students in your class cheating? Well, no. He says, but that's your moral opinion. Well, it's in my room, my classroom, and they'll abide by that. And he says, but well, there's nothing wrong with cheating, right? Or well, there's nothing intrinsically wrong with cheating. And I think herein lies the problem. And I realize, we start getting into the fact-value distinction. It's a lot more complicated than most people realize. And maybe we can talk about that more. But the point is that the fact when we reduce morality down to opinions, or which is implicit this idea of moral relativism, then you've removed the element of truth. Why should I treat people who believe differently with respect? That seems to be a moral assertion that's claiming to be a fact.
Right.
See, so once
I like it, or it seems like the right thing to do.
So once you remove truth out of this equation in terms of tolerance,
which
it then becomes an issue of. And Nietzsche saw this, back in up to
turn of the century.
Turn of the century, that once we get rid of truth, then all that's left is power. And I think we see this on full display today in the political debates, on Facebook, because now it becomes a matter of we want to impose our will on other people rather than trying to determine what is the truth. Because if you presume that truth is not available, then that's all you have left.
Right. So I think that's, and that is why sort of the way the Constitution says it is really intriguing. It says we hold these truths to be which is Thomas Reed.
Right. That's common sense rule.
Self-evident.
Yeah.
That all people are created equal.
And I could go on and on about what do you mean, what's meant by that.
I understand.
But I think the point is that it's true. It's true for everyone. It's a universal truth, and it's accessible to anybody. We can see this to be the case, and that has to be the base, and that's the basis by which this republic can stand.
Right, and that's what I was going to say. As soon as you don't see that as the whole, then the tribalism can seep in.
Fact,
versus
so,
saying,
I don't know. I think you're right, but my question at this point goes to something super pragmatic: is that if we live in a now post-truth society, how then can you? It's almost like it's seen as a reversion back to something that's objective truth, right? So how are we going to move forward into something that's homogenous with a bunch of different cultures, right?
Can't.
So like,
I mean,
that's
put it bluntly,
that's what I wonder. How could we get to some sort of objective truth from where we're at right now?
I would argue that the denial of objective truth leads not only to a confused epistemology, a theory of knowledge and truth, but it has the practical consequences of social anarchy. We will not. I mean, I'll go. I mean, and this is not something Mike Gurney came up with.
That's
I go back to Plato, Aristotle. I go back to Jesus. But that without truth, you can't live, and you can't flourish as a society. In fact, it's interesting to me was when I was studying the Greek philosophers, and particularly in the area of political philosophy, a lot of them really looked at democracy as a dirty word. Because democracy, in fact, up until recently, democracy was not seen as a good thing, because democracy was generally because it was the idea of mob rule. Oh. And of course, if
mobs can be stupid, if the majority of people are stupid in society, then the minority should rule. The minority, learned, wise class who knows what's best for you.
And that's why.
This is why Plato talked about the sophistry, because he was like, the sophists can persuade lots of people, but in falsity, not in truth.
Exactly. So if we say there is no objective truth, you have your truth, I have my truth, or whatever, you can't flourish in community. I think that's just.
I think that to your point of this common sense realism, there's certain things that seem to be self-aware to us, but even if you haven't thought about the grounding for why it is. I once talked to a student who was the president of the Students Against Slavery Club, and she was not a Christian. She might call herself spiritual but not religious, and I just asked her, why are you so passionate about this? And her answer was, well, it's wrong, this should happen, it just feels wrong. And she couldn't really give a grounding as to why, and kind of said, well, yeah, I believe it's wrong too. This is why I believe it is wrong to hold humans as slaves, as property, because as you mentioned, they're entitled to certain dignity.
I think all
being created in the image
all
of
of us
God.
have certain, and this goes back to Thomas Reed's view, all of us have certain rational and moral intuitions.
Yes.
And that's why I said it's the great irony, I think, of the day, that on the one hand, people widely embrace moral relativism, but on the other hand, get all fired up about justice. And rightly so. I think we should get fired up about justice. But the problem is that there's an fundamental incoherence there.
Yes.
And I think what they're doing is, the late Francis Schaeffer used to call it borrowed capital. That we have the people take these ideas and still live them out. I mean, you cannot live. I mean, one of my I think a pragmatic argument against moral relativism is you cannot live as a moral relativist. I've never met a moral relativist that could live consistently with a moral relativist.
Well, isn't that basically what Kant said in the Critique of Practical Reason? He said, we can't use any classic methodology to prove God exists, but we should live as if he does, because he conceded there's no other framework for a moral society. So even if you can't necessarily objectively believe it's true, live as if it is true, or else.
I think Kant would say yes, there is a God, and we can't. He rejects the classical arguments, but he's right. He calls it a practical postulate.
Yes,
and he knows there's objective morality. Now, a lot of critics of Kant would say, "Well, how do you know there's And they would criticize him on that. But I think he is. I wish he would have read more Thomas Reid. I think he would have straightened him out on that point. But
Reid before or after Kant?
They were contemporary.
Oh, they were contemporary.
Yes, the same as Hume. In fact, Reid mostly wrote to Hume.
Okay.
A lot of his stuff.
Kant.
Most of his stuff was to refute Hume, and Hume is the only thing that people learn in most philosophy
Not
departments.
the other side of it.
Well, Thomas Reid was way more influential. Yeah. Everyone was reading him. The entire people who wrote the Constitution had definitely read Thomas Reid. He's the most influential as far as political theory, not favorite philosopher of philosophy departments.
Well, I think epistemology.
Well, that's why they use the word self-evident, because that's a Thomas Reid thing. And I want to go back to Daniel's question. I think he's trying to get pragmatic here, right? We're going to land the plane.
We've got 23 minutes to get pragmatic.
Okay.
No. Ask your question again, and then I want to make sure. I want to summarize real quickly.
Well, my point is, if it seems like it's a self-evident observation that we live in a post-truth society, so that we have lots of different factions, some more powerful than others, who have their very different ideas of justice. And now, in this current state, we're clashing heads with these traditional types of justice and this idea that we deserve more justice. We want retribution, we want minority rights, we want all this stuff. And so, there's this conflict, but there's this, we've swept the rug out, basically, from underneath this idea of objective truth. So now what do we do? Where do we come back to some sort of? That's the question.
I would make a different argument. I don't think it just comes down to political power. I think pragmatically that's what people want, because there's a huge sense of tribalism involved in, those people got my back, these people got my back. Well, I know that, and they're infighting, and
eventually all revolutions will turn on one another.
My hope, and what I would offer is, and it would not be a quick answer, it would be a very long-winded one, but it would be this. It would be like, okay, you don't like the way things are, I understand that. So let's go and let's study history, and let's look at the outcomes of, for example, I would say, if you want a political revolution, let's go study political revolutions, and you show me where one turned out really, really good. And what I would offer them is to say, if we don't learn from history, we're bound to repeat it. And so I would ask them to be reasonable, and just to say, you don't have to accept my view of the world, but let's just go back and look at pragmatically what these sort of things lead to. And I would also argue just the general sense, and I think most people could understand this, when you destabilize a country, a region, you set it back. So think about the long-term history of the world. Why is it that huge revolutions happened between huge spans of each other? I would argue war, destabilization, constant infighting, and so in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? When your basic needs are met, you have time and the freedom to think about the other things that you can take care of. And so the interesting thing is that if you want to move forward as a society, one of the things you don't want to do is to cause it to have major instability. You want to enact reforms, like I would say Martin Luther King did very successfully. There is a way to go about it, although as frustrating and as difficult as it might be. Obama's quoted as saying, hey, democracy is this thing where it's you go one step forward, then you go two steps back, and then it's frustrating. Yeah. But I think it's better than what I would call the alternative. And so I would ask people to come together with this thing and say, like, do you think, and can everyone agree at least that what's contained in the Constitution is relevant for all Americans? And there's some semblance then of, even if somebody rejects truth, that there is a working system which people can agree to then to begin to outwardly work out their differences.
Yeah, I'm less optimistic, and I would go back to your example. When you compare the American Revolution with the French Revolution, I think the significant difference, and of course, Edmund Burke, reflection on this has some, I think, relevance here, but the difference is that these ideas are truths. We hold these truths to be self-evident, and it's the confidence there is truth, and it may not always be easily accessible, but it's there, and it's hard, but it's even harder to live it out. See, that's why I say I think pragmatism is a dead end, because pragmatism will always lose in the end. I mean, when I say pragmatism, I'm referring to kind of a pragmatic conception of truth.
You're saying that nobody can completely live out the worldview in actuality.
I think there's a lot more people who are, maybe I'm naive, I think there's a lot more good-willed people who genuinely do want good things for everyone, but maybe they haven't really thought very hard about the pragmatic rules of the game that they're living out right now, the forcing of choosing of sides that's happening in politics, where if they could be a little bit freed from that and get some context, they might be like, you know what, we, the people, and I think there's a lot of power in that, would begin to move forward away from tribalism.
I'm just not confident that, certainly practical considerations can play. So if you say pragmatism in terms of, in the classical conception, the classical school of pragmatism, where, pragmatic means as a way to discover truth. But of course, what's today in terms of pragmatism, what's called neo-pragmatism, and an example would be Richard Rorty, who's now deceased, but his argument would be there is no truth at the capital T. Truth is what, he's famously quoted as, truth is what appears and that you get away with. Here's the problem. The political implications of that for Rorty is that you create a socialist state, because it's about controlling people and power, because otherwise power becomes untamable. And that's why I said I think even Rorty's view is unduly optimistic. Yes, people are capable of doing good things, but I think the biblical view of humanity is more, in my judgment, is more accurate in terms of we were created good, but we're gone bad. That is, we also, even the best among us, are quite capable of doing wrong things.
Well, and I think you see that rooted in the Constitution, again, getting back to the American model of recognition that people are by their nature prone to evil and corruption. And so...
It's the separation of powers.
Exactly.
Right?
And that's the idea and that's what frustrates me with some, and I'm not here to take political sides. One thing I find ironic is that some on the progressive side of politics today advocate power to the people, and individual people, and what they mean by that is socialism. What happens in socialism? The state, a smaller group of people, have immensely more power over the individuals. And I've used this example before of, the Enron scandal back in 2001. It was terrible. People lost their life savings. It was a horrible example of what you call crony capitalism. But the scope of damage was here, whereas imagine the entire federal government that controls everything without any oversight.
Just look at the Soviet Union.
Look at Venezuela today, where the damage is every area of society.
Right. I think the fundamental difference is that businesses have a form of self-correcting that can happen, meaning they can fail. Governments generally don't.
Right.
There's no self-correcting mechanism.
There's no police of the government when the government
The reason why I'm a
police.
capitalist is not because capitalism is perfect. It isn't. But I think the problem with socialism, and if you go all the way back to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, his presumption here is that humans are basically good.
Yeah.
And the problem is when you if you operate in that presumption, then you can have people in power who make the decisions, and you can have this kind of, as Rousseau
humans are bad, capitalism works because your own self-interest is the motivating
factor. Not just self-interest, but it's the decentralization of political power.
And the mutual interest in succeeding.
In other words, that even in a capitalistic society, yes, wrongs can be done. There is crony capitalism. but it is less concentrated in terms of political power and economic consequences than what you see in a socialist economy.
Well, and I've heard it said a lot of times before, and I totally agree, that perfect is often the enemy of better. That people say, again, reactionaries say, well, this system isn't perfect, so let's completely throw it away and do the exact opposite. Again, you see an example of abuse in capitalism, any system that you could see. So let's I mean, you're seeing this right now with the defund the police movement. However you might feel about it, it's like, okay, I've also heard the saying, never make an important decision when you're upset. And I think there's a lot of emotivism in that we have this reactionary tendency to say, well, there is a flaw in this system, so let's completely throw it out.
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily just go to say socialism as a whole. I would say authoritarianism. Like I think socialism, there is a way that you could do. So Here, I would put it this way, like, fascism is often said, oh, that's right wing, and communism's left wing, but they're both authoritarian states because the power is completely and utterly in the government's hands, not in the people's hands. This is why I'm a libertarian, because I don't want the government to have undue power. I want them to have appropriate power. And so I would see it, not necessarily just as the word socialism, but if authoritarianism, if you give people a giant iron fist, be prepared for them to swing the hammer and probably not swing it in the most just way.
To push back a little bit, I think the ideal government, and I don't think any human government is capable of being an ideal government. The only ideal government is the kingdom of God. And that's a purely authoritarian because it's ruled by God.
Well, even Luther.
The reason why it works and why it's always just is because God is perfectly just. Yeah. He's all-knowing and he's always wise.
Well, even Luther acknowledged that, where he said an earthly kingdom can't exist without the inequality of persons. He recognizes there's always going to be certain inequalities.
Any political system we come up with that's human is going to be flawed because it's human. And that's why.
I think that the greatest good for individuals is their individual freedom to choose what's good for them. In fact, I think that's enshrined in the Constitution. I don't see how anyone can disagree with that, because your pursuit of happiness can fundamentally disagree with somebody else's pursuit of happiness. But the truth is that you choose to coexist.
Well, let me to disagree agreeably with you again. And this is the reason why I'm not a libertarian, because I think humans are social animals. And I think, yes, individual rights are important, but we also have certain social responsibilities in virtue of living in community. And you cannot have a flourishing community without that. And I think the Founding Fathers understood that. But they believe that's the reason why we have the First Amendment. And particularly the religious clause in the First Amendment, because they acknowledged that the church, regardless of particular denominational affiliation or even deist, the idea was that that churches have the primary responsibility in our political system to promote virtue, and included in that virtue is not just individual virtue but civic virtue. So even and that's why I think a libertarianism that ignores civic virtue is flawed.
I would disagree with that.
That's
agreeably.
See, you like my definition.
Yeah. We've had a similar one that we've said. Tolerance is in disagreement, choosing to treat each other with dignity and respect. Yeah. So what I would say is, I think the Founding Fathers looked around and what they saw was, why did people come from Europe? I mean, the evidence to me is clear. They came because a lot of religious persecution, and they wanted an opportunity for land. And that's why John Locke, actually, the original quote is from John Locke: life, liberty, and land.
Well, and self-determination, the ability to shape your own destiny.
Exactly. And so I actually see the Constitution as far more libertarian than the idea of, social virtues is a commonality when people are homogenous, but that the whole purpose of the Constitution, as I understand it, is to put in place in other words, one Christian group can't say to another group, the Puritans, oh, you can't exist and we're going to persecute you. Like, they're protected now. So their own individual autonomy is a protection. And so what I feel like is they looked around the world and they were like, man, governments seem to take everyone's rights away. They seem to not protect individuals. They seem not to allow people to worship by themselves, and kind of enshrine the idea that we can individually coexist. And it might be true that we don't all share the same common virtues, but that if you give the Constitution its due, that principle by itself allows people to intermix who don't see eye to eye. Because you're agreeing, this is the whole thing, you're agreeing that there is a standard by which all people can live out their life. You have a right to life,
I think when you
liberty, which is your freedom,
right,
and your own pursuit of happiness. And our pursuits of happiness can be diametrically opposed. But that's what's allowed underneath that.
Well, yeah, but I think you're, I don't know if we want to spend a lot of time on this, but I think you're somewhat cherry picking the Constitution is really meant to constrain government.
Right. I would agree.
And it's an acknowledgement of certain fundamental human rights. But I think, once again, it's understood. I mean, because the idea of individualism, it's starting to develop. It's still, for the most part, in those early years of the colonies and the creation of this new nation, still people were publicly minded, especially the Puritans. The Puritans were not individualists.
Well, no, I would agree with you.
Right. And I think that's typical of most people. So for them, it's.
But they did want what I mean, I would agree with you. The idea of like stark, rigid individualism, where I'm just a person, I have no effect. That's not what I mean. What I mean is that when they looked at the way governments worked,
right? Because
they kind of said, we would rather the highest value be in the individual rather than the authority.
And saying that doesn't negate.
But I think you have to be more specific here. It's the divine right of kings. That's what Locke is writing against. And of course, for the colonists and the founding fathers, their thing is they want to push back against the tyranny of the crown.
Right. Yeah. No taxation without representation.
It's a very much more narrow focus. So, and of course, I think the problem, because hindsight's always 20/20, right? I think part of the problem is that since they are children of the Enlightenment, I think there tends to be a presumption here in the basic goodness of humanity, and I don't think they anticipated. And I think these guys are geniuses. I mean, the creation of the Constitution, I think even to this day, it's not a perfect document, but it's incredibly, I think it's the most genius political document ever written. And I think they try to anticipate certain things, but they still, I think that as our culture has changed, for good or for ill, it makes it a challenge. And that's why I think my own view,
you're fine.
My own prognostication, if you will, is I don't know if this American experiment will last, to be honest, because of the pluralization of culture, religion, because in order for it to succeed, there still has to be these shared public values that are evaporating.
Maybe my perception is that the Constitution is not going to be strong enough to support the moral framework for an entire society to rest on and to cling to.
Well, especially if society rejects, if society embraces moral relativism, then, just on a practical level, somebody can say, well, why should I obey, and we see this in Portland, why should I obey the law if I think the law is wrong? Right. I have no moral obligation because I determine what's right and wrong. Not the law.
A lot of people rejected the entire premise of America completely from the idea that because the America was started by people that are completely flawed and allowed these systems to take place.
Where's the better system?
I get that, but they've already rejected it. You can't get back. You can't redeem George Washington and Thomas Jefferson from this new postmodern idea that they cannot be redeemed. Therefore, the entire country is illegitimate. The Constitution, the everything. So my question is, we have these people. They're there. They're in Seattle. They're in Portland. They seem to be growing. There seems to be like an idea that's moving forward that the country itself was founded on something that cannot be redeemed.
So the root of a bad tree, you have to cut the entire tree down and start.
Right. So is this going to keep going, or are we going to get back to something?
That's espoused, I think, in the neo-Marxism, or what they call cultural Marxism, of guys like Herbert Marcuse. We're seeing this come to fruition. The stuff that was radical in the 60s.
For our listeners, who is Herbert Marcuse?
Herbert Marcuse was a very prominent writer. He was a Marxist who, in fact, probably Marcuse, particularly contribution to what's called the Frankfurt School, also known as it's called critical theory. It comes out of the Frankfurt School. Marcuse is kind of his mostly well-known contribution is kind of synthesizing Freud and Marx. Okay. And I haven't read a lot of Marcuse. I've read some. He's kind of hard to read, frankly. I don't know. I don't know what's about these German guys. Kant, Hegel, Heidegger, Marcuse.
Hegel was the hardest to read out of all of them.
Yeah, I don't know. Heidegger's not that easy.
He doesn't land the plane ever.
Speaking of landing the plane,
Kant is like.
But anyway,
we got 4 minutes left,
okay.
so let's gently
to go back
this.
I think the only hope we really have, to be honest with you, is people have got to change their beliefs about there is objective morality, there is truth, and I want to tie this in as a Christian. I think that's why it's so important to have the perspective that this kingdom will not last. I mean, I think the prophet Daniel, read the book of Daniel, I think he makes that point compellingly clear. Every human kingdom will fail, including in his day the Babylonian kingdom and the Persian kingdom. So our only hope is in the kingdom of God. But as a Christian, I'm called to be salt and light. And I think to go back to both Peter and Paul, I think it's interesting. Both Peter and Paul commend the Christians of their day to submit to the king, despite the fact that these kings that Caesar was, especially Nero, was a horrible person. Because as Paul points out, that God has instituted these governments to punish evildoers. He doesn't do it perfectly, but I think we have to just, what Reinhold Niebuhr calls, we have to seek after what he calls proximate justice. But we're never going to achieve pure justice on earth because we're humans and we're born unequal. And I think so for me, my hope and confidence isn't in America. I mean, I love my country. I served my country 6 years in the military. I was willing to give my life for my country. Still am. But my country is still, as a Christian, the kingdom of God for me is the higher calling.
Well, and if we're okay going a few minutes over, which sounds like we are, there's on that question of identity and community, there's a question I've been just wanting to get your thought on for a while. Do you think that a lot of the contention and the shifting idea of what should be tolerated, what should not be, is in people redefining what a community is? And it depends on where you draw that line. Some people would say the community is your nation. As Americans, that is our primary community. And some would say, no, my primary community is my other ethnic, people of similar ethnicity to me who happen to reside in America, or my religious community. So however you draw that line of, you have obligations, you would say, towards your community. And I think you even see this within the Christian circle. And R.C. Sproul once talked about, he said, in the parable of the Good Samaritan, he says, every person on the planet is my neighbor. Not every person is my brother or my sister. And, there is covenant community within the Christian circle. If I have obligations, again, towards my fellow believers, towards my church family, especially towards my wife and my closest form of community that I don't necessarily have towards a stranger on the street. There are different levels of obligation. So would you say that depending on where you draw that line of community, your idea of what should be tolerated, because then that gets back to the point that Richard is making of the other, where you say, well, I don't have to tolerate somebody who is not of my community. They are of this community, so I don't owe them the same level of tolerance.
Good question.
I think it's a great question. In fact, it's interesting. I was just reading this morning, and I've been reading through the Gospel of Matthew, and he makes a rather startling statement when he's teaching and his family shows up. They're trying to get in, and he says, and I don't know about you, but sometimes I read the God and I read some of the statements of Jesus. It's like, what? And he says, who are my mothers and brothers, right? Or who are my if you're my disciples, you're my brother and brothers. And you go, what is he talking about? Let me try to tie that in there. We belong to multiple communities. But not all communities are equal.
Giant Venn diagram.
Yeah, and it's very confusing. Yeah. I think our highest allegiance has to be, as a Christian, has to be to God and his kingdom. Mm-hmm. But, and this is where I think people can misconstrue Jesus' statement. That doesn't mean he devalued his mother. Of course. Or his brothers.
The unique relationship that his biological mother.
But that he's acknowledging that the highest relationship is to God and his community. But because of my highest allegiance, and that's why when Jesus was asked by the legal scholar, what's the greatest commandment? He says to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Mm-hmm. But he didn't stop there. He said, and love your neighbor. Mm-hmm. And it's always, I wish he would have stopped there, but he didn't. Mm-hmm. To love your neighbor as yourself. Yeah. And I think the reason why that naturally follows loving God is because when I recognize that person, who's not my religion or not my ethnicity or not my people I prefer to be around.
Gender in some case, however you draw that line.
Whatever categories you want to use, but that person's still in the image of God. And because I love God and because God loves me despite my sinfulness, then I am called to love that person the same way I love myself.
Yeah.
And I think that's the great, in my judgment, that's the great equalizer, if you will. And that's what allows, I think, actually for justice to actually happen.
And maybe not even just yourself, but also your tribe and your community that you associate yourself with. Like give them the same sort of respect and dignity that you would give.
It extends to every human person because they're in the image of God.
Well, and I think you see that born out, and this isn't to say that because of this Christianity is the right religion, but I think when you look at the Christian faith throughout the centuries, it is the most not homogenous. It's the biggest melting pot of any major world religion. It transcends culture.
It goes culture to culture.
Exactly. It transcends any particular culture. Again, Islam never really had its Acts 15 moments. There's still this incredibly significant cultural connection between the religion, the worldview of Islam, and the Middle Eastern culture, and other religions as well. The Hindu culture and the Indian culture, and that you see within the Christian.
To be Islamic?
What'd you say?
I mean, can you be Islam? Can you convert to Islam?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And in fact, there's an interesting.
Don't you have to learn Arabic to read the Quran?
Yeah. The Quran only exists in Arabic.
I would recommend if you ever get a chance, watch this. Denzel Washington. I can't remember the name of the movie.
It was just Malcolm X was the name of the movie. Yeah.
And of course, for Malcolm X, one of the things was when he went to Mecca, and he realized that there were Muslims there that weren't just Arabs. They were, they weren't
Africans,
just black.
Europeans.
They were all sorts. And so I think to some extent, Islam acknowledges that there aren't these ethnic distinctions. Yeah. So in some ways they have that. But what's interesting to me is that I don't see anywhere in Islam, and I could be wrong on this, and I'm certainly willing to, if anybody knows a passage in the Quran that encourages this, where you have the same idea as what Jesus says to love your neighbor as yourself. Mm-hmm. And the neighbor extends to not just people who believe like you.
Exactly.
I mean, like I said, I know they're Muslim. I have friends who are Muslims who are very good people. They're very good neighbors. They treat non-Muslims very well. But I think when you look at the history of Islam, that's not always been the case. In fact, I think that's the exception rather than the rule. And like I said, I could be wrong on that. But yeah.
So, I just want to kind of. So you were getting at the idea. So one of the things I've thought a lot about, and I don't know, what's that?
It looks like you have 10 ideas.
Yeah, I do. I have a lot of ideas. My brain goes way faster than I can talk.
I'm gonna use the bathroom while you're getting that idea out. I'll be back.
I think one of the keys is there. I would differentiate slightly and say, I think there are people who can probably be just fine not thinking that there's one absolute truth to everything, but that there are people who generally understand that there has to be a core identity to people of a nation. And so what I'm getting at here is, to answer your question, people who think that the nation's illegitimate, well, they're members of the nation, right? And so the more we can help people understand and see each other, and this is what I would say, and this is what I think all divisive rhetoric is trying to do. It tries to differentiate people as though we aren't the same.
But yeah, that's an interesting point.
And so the rhetoric is part. I mean, I'm a rhetoric major. So like, for example, you read an article and it tells you these kinds of people are the problem, and then you go, well, I'm not that kind of person. You've differentiated yourself from that other person in a way that isn't, I don't think, actually. And so this is what happens: is the more that is allowed to happen, the more you're going to create separation. The more you're going to get extremes on the side. I think one of the quick ways to dissolve this is to allow people to have a general understanding. For example, when governors talk about New York, they'll always say, it's very different. It's almost like saying we're an American. They'll say, we New Yorkers. They want people to see the commonality in them. And I think that for a vibrant, healthy America, the more we can say we Americans and people can identify with that, I think there's a really good health that can bring about where we can start to have some exchanges. But as long as it's, well, those people over there are bad and I don't talk to them and I don't have anything to do with them, I actually think we're making the problem worse. So we have to start talking to each other.
I agree with you in the sense that, yes, I think if we identify ourselves as Americans, that helps. But here's the problem as I see it, and maybe I can put this in the form of a question. But isn't what a lot of people who are protesting, isn't, for them, nationalism is a dirty word. In fact, they associate it with white supremacy. And what that I think reflects is that there's been, and I think we see this promoted in a lot of different venues, including universities, and the idea of globalism.
Because he was like one of the main people who said America is a great ideal. But he even said, in one of his commencement speeches, Barack Obama said, I'm proof that.
Right, but they see globalism as transcending nationalism, that global is the higher good. And that's what I'm saying, is a lot of these people who are protesting, I find protesting, they see nationalism and the idea of, you will not see them with a bumper sticker on their car saying, I'm proud to be an American. Well, in fact, in my apartment complex.
Really. Like ethnocentric.
In fact, I have one of my neighbors in my apartment complex has a bumper sticker that says, America was never great. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a common sentiment among a lot, especially the younger generation. So I agree with you that if we could encourage a national identity that embraces the diversity, but I think the premise in that is that nationalism is good, and that's a premise that I think a lot of people in our culture today are rejecting.
The reason why, I think one of the hard parts in any type of disagreement is, one of the things I don't think that people who are engaging in political discussion do is they're not fair to the people that they disagree with. So let me put it in, psychologically, humans want to be heard and understood. Mm-hmm. When you don't understand, for example, if someone heard me say something and then they totally just misrepresent it because their only goal is just to, shut him up and make him be quiet, that doesn't create a sense of shared understanding, shared responsibility. And so what I'm getting at is that as long as people engage with media, with stuff that makes the people that they think they disagree with, they may not even disagree with them that much. That's the funny part about when you actually get people to sit down and talk. The more they disagree with that, the more they're going to be able to hear and talk to people from different viewpoints and come to the conclusion that, hey, we all have a shared sense of being an American, and that
disengage. I think
because the people who,
a little confusing. I think what you mean is that if people can disengage,
with whatever political party they're a part of that's trying to tell them that everyone else is other. And this is the problem: is both people have to do it, both sides, right? Yeah. And so it's probably not going to happen. But if
you do it first, I swear we'll do it next.
But if you can do that, I do think there's movement. I think having spent most of my political life in the middle, always having people tell me that I'm not conservative enough or I'm not liberal enough. Literally, that's been my entire life. Yeah. You're not liberal enough. You're not conservative enough. You're not this. One of the things I'm always trying to do is to help people go, I don't think you're that different than what you think that person does. For example, a lot of people who are really critical of our nation, they see a blind, utter love for our nation as though it doesn't have any sins. And what they feel like, and I think they feel unheard about is, guys, there are major major faux pas in our past, and you're not willing to recognize them, and they feel like that's just glossed over by people that they would politically disagree with. And I would say, like, you know what, you're right. We have some major stains.
Hears about it.
At the same time, and this is what I would say is uniquely true about most people, right? There are some great people who have some major issues in their past, but that didn't destroy everything that they have to offer to society. Well, which is why I'm restorative in my view of people coming out of jail. We should be restorative with them. Yep. And so if you can get people to move to that place, and I'm not sure exactly how to do that, but to have those kind of, this is why I'm like very, very, very much, I tell everybody, I'm in the middle. You can label me whatever you want, but I want people to converse. I want people to have that dialogue, because I actually think it creates shared understanding and shared value. And when people feel heard, they feel understood. Then they don't feel like, oh, okay, well, you're just not listening to me at all, and why should I talk to you?
Well, and that gets back, and I'll make this my final point since we're about to wrap up here. I got an extended version today, so 15 minutes free. Yeah, I was gonna say, that'll make up for our technical issues. We've been super solid today, so way to go, awesome producer Daniel. But that just gets back to the point that we reiterate time and time and time again, is that it's a lot easier to disagree, to vilify somebody, to put them in the category of the other behind a screen on social media. It's a lot harder when you sit down, or you're willing to sit down face to face and say, okay, this is a human being, this is flesh and blood, they have a story, they have a mother just like me, they have a father just like me, they have experiences just like me. It's a lot harder to just vilify them and say they're not entitled to tolerance, they're not entitled to rights, versus when they're just an idea behind a screen. And again, we live in an age where when you can literally pick and choose who you want to hear from, what you want to see, and what you want to believe, it gets harder. You can go through life, and I said this before, I'll say it again. You know, it used to be where if you had to get along with your neighbor, you had to get along with your coworkers, or else you didn't have human interaction. And now we live in a society where you say, I don't have to give a damn about getting along with my neighbors. I don't have to worry about getting along with people I interact with. I can just go find people who already agree with what I agree with online and just associate with them. And
that's a really good observation and point, I think. That's as a practical takeaway, I just think it's so beneficial to be around people, to hang around people, to talk to people, to listen to people who are different than you, and to have different religious beliefs, to have different life experiences, different nationalities even. I mean, I spent a 6-month cruise courtesy of the U.S. Navy, traveling all over the world, and and it was an incredible experience, and just being able to engage people and talk to people and listen to people who were different than me, and I realized that was, for me, was just eye-opening that, wow, people they're different. I mean, there's similarities. There's some ways people are the same, but there's also differences. And just because we do things in America a particular way doesn't mean it's the right way. I mean, at least it got me to open up to that possibility and to think about, and just, and unfortunately, I think the church, we've not done a particularly good job, broadly speaking, of doing that. Especially here in America, and I think one of the things I have valued as a Christian is being in a church context where I had people who are from different countries who are Christians, and seeing how they how they live out their Christianity, and some of the differences in how they live out their Christianity, and it helps me to see some of my blind spots.
Absolutely. Well, and to be exposed to different ideas and cultures doesn't mean that you condone everything they do. And I think we live in that society, that's a flaw sometimes of our modern society, is that I can't even associate with them, because then again, people are going to think I'm condoning them. Or on the other flip side, where people say, well, you need to learn to listen. What they're really saying is, you need to listen and you need to change everything you believe by listening to them. It's like, I'm glad to listen. It doesn't necessarily mean after I listen and think about it critically that I'm necessarily going to change my mind. But people want, when they say listen, they mean listen and change everything you believe. That's my final thought. Daniel, you got any final thoughts from behind the screen?
I think, if I can leave our listeners with anything, I really encourage you, don't expect everyone else to have to do what you yourself believe is the highest ideal. Like, if you think people should talk to each other, then go talk to each other and develop friendships and see people as people, not as bumper stickers of represented ideas. I mean, I really think the more you can get away with that, the more you can just be like, hey, these are people, and people have value and dignity. I think it's self-evident. I don't think you can have a modern culture that won't do nasty things to each other without that self-evident truth. But I really think that's just the model and way that you just continue to move forward.
I would say, in terms of virtues, I think there are moral virtues, and there are also what we call intellectual virtues. I think one of the intellectual virtues that's really important, and is humility. And when I teach my philosophy class, the first day of class, I say to my students, every one of us in this room, accepting God, presuming that God exists, which I think God does, but other than God, all the rest of us are quite fallible and likely have false beliefs. And I think that having that posture, I think, is critical of being willing to listen. Sometimes when I've talked with the atheists, for example, I'm convinced that atheism is false, but I could be wrong. Mm-hmm. I'm willing to listen to their reasons and to get to, and not just to do an intellectual exchange, but even to get to know them as a person.
Yeah.
So I think humility can be really, and I'm not saying I've mastered it by no stretch of the imagination, have I? But I'd really try to strive that.
Best at humility.
Yeah.
Everyone else's humility sucks.
Yeah, that's right. I'm so proud to be humble,
yes.
Right? So anyway, I think that goes a long way in helping create a genuine tolerance, true tolerance.
I think humility is a good note to leave it on. Thank you all so much. Thanks, Mike, for coming all the way down to little old Salem.
Yeah. Thank you
for us small towners. Yeah. Well, I have a feeling we'll be having you back in the months and years ahead, hopefully, as long as we can keep this up.
I also do want to say this. I think that if our nation and our universities are going to build more cohesive units of trust going forward, I think we have to dialogue.
Yes.
I just think that's true.
Yeah.
I think we have to dialogue, and we have to encourage it. Hence why we're doing this.
Yes. Well, thank you guys for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for being here so much. We hope you guys enjoyed it. If you have questions or comments that you'd like us to follow through on, please feel free to leave them below. We'd love to interact and dialogue with you. If anybody watching there, listening, is interested in being on here with us too, please reach out and contact, and we will try to make it happen.
Yeah, and Daniel, I'd like to again have the power to control what's on the screen, so I can put things above Garrett's head. Please and thank you. Please and thank you.
No, that's not
No. Don't say no.
That will not happen.
This is the Agora.
We're signing off. See you all next week.